This is Harsh Rules, I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play Paths of Glory. Paths of Glory was released in 1999 by GMT Games and designed by Ted S. Racier. This game supports 2 players and takes 8 hours to play. Welcome back to the Harsh Rules breakdown for Paths of Glory. In this episode, we're going to focus on the game's sequence of play, which is comprised of 8 game phases. These 8 game phases make up a player's turn, and at the beginning of every turn, each player will roll a die to see if they're required to conduct any mandated offensives. Mandated offensives are meant to simulate the internal politics of each side in the conflict. In these coalitions, there is a constant suspicion that a member of the group is not doing their fair share of the fighting. Therefore, a member nation of the group may have to conduct a required attack to prove their commitment to the war. To see if a nation is required to conduct an attack, each side rolls a die on their mandated offensive table. This diplomacy requirement is determined by each player rolling a 6-sided die and mapping the result to a nation on the table. The die results are then tracked throughout the turn with a special marker. If the nation selected to conduct a mandated offensive does not do so by the end of the turn, it penalizes their side by a victory point. If the die result equals none, or is a nation that is currently neutral, there is no effect. If the nation's capital, or capitals in the case of Austria-Hungary, are under enemy control, the nation does not have a mandated offensive, and the marker is shifted 1 space to the right on the table. To meet the mandated offensive requirement, the nation listed must conduct at least 1 attack that turn against an enemy combat unit. However, some nations have specific requirements. Let's begin by looking at the Central Powers. Austria-Hungary can attack any allied unit. However, if Italy has entered the war and the die result is the 2nd place, then Austria-Hungary must conduct an attack in Italy, or with a unit whose supply line runs through Italy. If Italy has not entered the war, then treat this space the same as the first Austria-Hungary space. If the result is Turkey and they've entered the war, they can attack any allied unit. If the result is Germany, then they must attack a US, British, Belgian, or French unit in France, Germany, or Belgium. To keep track of things, once the mandated offensive has been completed by the assigned nation, move the marker to the None or Made box. Now, let's look at the Allied mandated offensive table. If the die result is France or Britain, these nations must attack a German unit in France, Belgium, or Germany. Be aware, though, that Austrian, Canadian, Portuguese, and Arab North ally units do not count for this purpose. If the die result is Italy or Russia, then they can attack any Central Powers unit. And, like the Central Powers, once the allied player has completed their mandated offensive requirement, move the marker to the last box to show that it's been made. Several event cards in the game will modify the die results as well as eligible nations on these tables. Be on the lookout for these as you play through the game. Let's briefly talk about some of these events. First, French Mutiny. When the French Mutiny event is played, flip the Allied mandatory offensive marker over to its French Mutiny side. In this state, any current and future French mandated offensive result is considered to be French Mutiny, and attacks are not required. However, be aware any attacks with French units are penalized. If any French units that are not stacked with US units attack on a French mandated offensive result, the Allied powers are penalized by adding 1 victory point. This penalty is for the whole turn, not for each attack. Once this penalty is suffered, the French mutiny effects are nullified for the rest of the current turn, and the mandated offensive marker is placed in the none or made box to keep track of this. Second, the Hoffman event. Once this event has been played, add a +1 to all future Central Powers mandated offensive die rolls. This makes it easier for the Central Powers to roll a die result of a 5 or 6 and not have a mandated offensive. Third, HL takes command. Once this event is played, mandated offensive die results for Germany are ignored for the rest of the game. Fourth, once the Bolshevik Revolution event has been played, mandated offensive die results for Russia are ignored for the rest of the game. Now, let's move on to the next phase. The next phase in the sequence of play is the action phase. We covered this phase in the last episode, so if you want a refresher, rewatch episode 2. Third up is the attrition phase. In this phase, players check their army and corps units to ensure they can trace a path back to a friendly supply source. Throughout the game, units must remain within supply to maintain full functionality. If a unit is cut off from their supply source, they may not move or attack. They cannot strategically redeploy, they cannot dig trenches, or benefit from combat events. And if they do not have a supply source when the attrition phase rolls around, they are eliminated. Eliminated out-of-supply corps units are placed in the replaceable units box. Eliminated out-of-supply armies may not be replaced and are removed from the game. The Central Powers have 4 supply sources: Essen, Breslau, Sofia, and Constantinople. The Allied powers have 2 sets of supply sources. For Russian, Serbian, and Romanian units, eligible supply sources are Petrograd, Moscow, Kharkov, the Caucasus, and Belgrade. These forces may not use sea lanes to trace back to these sources, or London. A quick exception though, Serbian forces may also use Salonika as an eligible supply source if it is under Allied control. The supply source for the remaining Allied units is London. Paris is not eligible as a supply source. Another important note about supply sources. They are not available until the nation that controls them enters the war. For example, the Central Powers cannot use Constantinople as a supply source until Turkey enters the war. Keep these rules in mind as you play through the game. Fourth is the siege phase. Before we talk specifically about the events in this phase, let's back up and discuss forts and sieges themselves. Throughout the map, there are star-shaped spaces called forts. Forts are locations, not units. And as a location, they cannot be activated to move or attack on their own. When they're occupied, there is no additional cost for activation. They do not count against a space's stacking limits, and they do not require supply lines. However, units occupying forts do require supply lines. Forts provide bonuses for the defender, not the attacker. This means that occupants must be eliminated first before losses affect a fort, even if enemy units retreat from them. If a fort is unoccupied, it can still be attacked. It is assumed that a fort has a small garrison attached to it. The garrison bit is not in the rules. This is what the player base assumes to explain the rules. As a result, unoccupied forts that are attacked cannot be flank attacked, they cannot take advantage of trenches, and combat cards cannot be played to support them. However, unoccupied forts that are attacked can defend themselves, hence the garrison theory. While we're on the topic, a quick rules exception to be aware of. Russian forts cannot be attacked until the Oberst event is played. So next, we're going to walk through an example for an attack against an unoccupied fort. Let's look at a combat example for an unoccupied fort. Step 1. Designate combat. The attacker identifies the fort space the spaces they will attack from, and the units they will use to conduct the attack. Step 2. Determine combat strengths. The combat strength for the French in this example is a 4, 3 for the army combat factor, and 1 for the corps combat factor. The unoccupied fort has a defense combat factor of 3. This is the number printed in the pentagon below the fort space star. I presume this is the fort's garrison. For step 3, play trench negating combat card, and step 4, attempt flank attack, the following rules apply. Unoccupied forts never benefit from trenches in their space, and they can never be the target of a flank attack. Therefore, we skip these steps. For step 5, play combat cards, and step 6, determine dice roll modifier. We're going to skip these as well. Combat cards cannot be played in support of an unoccupied fort, and that means we do not need to modify the dice roll. Next is step 7, determine the fire column. The attacker has an army in their forces, so they use the army fire table. The combat strength is 4, so they use the 4th column. Now, the unoccupied fort's garrison uses the corps fire table, specifically column 3. Also remember that unoccupied forts cannot use trenches in their space, so no column shifting for trenches. Now, for step 8, determine results. The number in the pentagon at the bottom of the fort is also the fort's loss factor. Forts only have one step. Therefore, the attacking forces must roll at least a 3 in their column to destroy the fort. The attacker rolls a 5. This plots to a fire result of 4. The Central Powers player then rolls for the uninhabited fort. Once again, the garrison at work. The die result is a 1, which means the firing result is also a 1. On to step 9, take losses. Since this was not a flank attack, the defender must assign their losses first. The firing result of 4 exceeds the unoccupied fort's loss factor, and the fort is destroyed. Place a destroyed marker on the fort space. The Allied Powers player must now absorb the single loss from that pesky garrison. The French corps unit is selected to absorb the loss. Step 10, determine the winner. The French have won. Their firing result was 4, the unoccupied fort's firing result was 1. Step 11, defender retreat is not applicable, which leads us to step 12, attack or advance. Since the fort was destroyed, full-strength units may now advance into its space. Therefore, the French army could advance into the fort space. Hopefully this example gives you an idea of how combat functions versus an unoccupied fort. Now, before we move on, let's briefly discuss what would happen if the fort was occupied. If the fort space is occupied, then the defender adds the fort's combat factor to its combat strength. Remember, a fort only adds its combat factor to defending units, not attacking units. So if you're attacking from a fort space, you don't get the benefit. Combat then proceeds normally until step 9, take losses. When taking losses, forts only absorb losses after all occupying units have been eliminated. This means to destroy the fort and advance into its space, the firing result must be large enough to eliminate all occupying units and have enough left over to destroy the fort itself. Since the maximum firing result is 7 on the army table, a fort space with several units can be quite a challenge to overcome, if not downright impossible. This means it may take several attacks to eliminate all the units occupying the fort and then destroy it. Now that we understand how forts function in a standard attack, let's look at the second option for taking them on with a siege. Okay, let's discuss sieges with a simple example. First of all, it's important to note that a siege cannot be conducted until all occupying forces in the fort space are eliminated. Once enemy units are removed from the fort space, a player may attack the empty fort to destroy it, like we saw previously, or conduct a siege. In our example, the French Second Army decides to besiege an empty fort space. To besiege an enemy fort, either at least one army or a number of core units equal to the fort's loss factor must enter the fort space during a single action round and then stop movement. The French do have an army, so first they activate that space for movement and declare that army will move into the fort space to conduct a siege. Next, place a besiege marker on the fort space to mark its status. Once an enemy fort is besieged, other friendly units may ignore the enemy fort for all purposes including tracing supply. However, to maintain the siege, the besieging player must keep either an army unit or the core units required to meet the fort's loss factor. Other units in the fort space not tied to this requirement may attack out or move in and out of the space. If a player decides to attack the fort itself, he or she may use all available units in that space. If the units required to maintain the siege drop below the fort's loss factor, the besiege marker is removed. The occupying units do not need to retreat, but the fort is no longer eligible for the siege phase die roll, and supply may not be traced through the space. If additional friendly units enter the space, the total number of units must meet the fort's loss factor requirement again. When the siege phase arrives, all besieged forts must be checked to see if they surrender. A die is rolled for each besieged fort. If the number rolled is greater than the besieged fort's loss factor, the fort is eliminated and a destroyed marker is placed on the fort space. A quick note, all siege die rolls are modified by a -2 during the August and September 1914 turns. This reflects the shorter duration of 1 month during these turns. Fifth is the war status phase. We covered the rules for this phase in the first episode. Essentially, each player adds up their combat card points and adjusts the war status markers on the general records track. The combined war status marker is checked for automatic victory by being on space 0 for an Allied powers victory or space 20 for a Central powers victory. Once the combined war status marker hits space 30, the Zimmermann Telegraph event can be played to begin the process of bringing the Americans into the war. And if the marker lands on space 40, an armistice is declared. The individual war status markers for the Allied and Central powers will determine if a player's war commitment level has increased. A quick note, this is not checked on the first turn for August 1914. If the appropriate war status conditions are met, limited war or total war cards may be added to their draw pile at this time. Sixth is the replacement phase. In this phase, players can spend replacement points they've accumulated during the action phase to rebuild or replace units. As discussed in the first episode, each nation at war has an RP marker that records their points on the general records track. The box at the bottom of the strategy card indicates the number of points to add to each marker. Each side spends replacement points in the following order. First, the Allied powers player spends all their replacement points, and then the Central powers player. Any replacement points not spent during this phase are lost. Remember to reset all RP markers on the general records track to 0. Per the chart I built in the first episode, these are the way that replacement points can be spent. Follow the green arrows to see how. The first episode provides a detailed look at each of these opportunities, so let's move on to the next phase. Next, in the 7th phase, Draw Strategy card, each player draws cards from their draw pile to bring their hand back to 7 cards. Reshuffle discards as needed after dealing all other available cards to a player. A player may discard any combat card he wishes before drawing new cards. If a player has insufficient cards in his deck to fill his hand to the 7-card limit, he takes all available cards and begins the next turn with less than a full hand. If limited war or total war cards were added to the draw pile this turn, shuffle the draw pile and the discard pile together to form a new draw pile. Finally, the 8th phase is the end of the turn. If the war is not ended and the last turn of the scenario has not been reached, advance the game turn marker to the next turn on the turn record track and begin the sequence of play again with the mandated offensive phase. And with that, you've completed all 8 of the sequence of play phases. Hopefully, these rules breakdowns have helped you get acclimated enough with the fundamental rules to begin your own game of Paths of Glory. This is a wargaming classic and ranks in the top 10 war games on BoardGameGeek. With that said, there are an enormous amount of small exceptions throughout the rules that can trip up players. Fortunately, the Deluxe Edition provides several helpful reference sheets to help you navigate many of these. Be sure to have these handy as you play through the game. If you found this video helpful, please give me a like and share with your friends. To be the first notified when the next episode of Harsh Rules becomes available, please hit the bell icon for notifications. And as always, this has been Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.